In today's lecture, I'm going to kind of wrap up talking about Teddy Roosevelt. Kind of get into some of the things that happened under him, mostly like foreign policy wise. And then I'll, of course, get into later. I'll talk about Taft and Wilson that come in as presidents, of course, later. But I will be talking about that, that big stick diplomacy that Teddy Roosevelt's kind of known for, more or less. And of course, building the Panama Canal that y'all, of course, have heard of. Of course, probably the most famous thing he did foreign policy, when he was in power overall. So anyway, yeah, we're still kind of on the same period right now, talking about Teddy Roosevelt still. I think we just kind of talked about the domestic issues of Teddy Roosevelt, which I think we talked about the square deal and all that, that he was kind of known for. I did want to get into some of his, like I said, foreign policy ideas that Teddy Roosevelt was kind of known for. He was known for his famous policy that's, well, it's called different names. They often call it the big stick diplomacy is one name that they usually call it. It's called other names too. I think they call it the bully pulpit. I think it's kind of what he called the presidency and all that. But with that, but the foreign policies of Teddy Roosevelt, that name, so-called big stick, originate from a famous quote that he said, which was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far, young man," which, by the way, it's actually an African proverb that he knew and kind of used. Good morning, Patrice. Oh, we got somebody else joining, which is good. I hope you're having a great afternoon out there, of course. But yeah, it was an African proverb that he kind of used as a motto for his foreign policies, more or less. And I can blow this up for you right here. But he basically wanted to try and strengthen the U.S. as a world power, not just in militarily, whatever, but foreign policy, but also in dealing with, of course, Latin America. And one of the things he wanted to do, if you know about it, he wanted to strengthen the Monroe Doctrine to prevent foreign powers from really coming into the Americas, because there were some cases where you had some countries that were trying to come into Latin America and take over, like the British and the French, etc. And so he was hoping to keep them out or keep them limited. And he believed that the Americas is our sphere of influence. That's what he believed. This went all the way back to James Monroe and so on. And so they talked about in the video, he issued that famous Roosevelt Corollary, which I think was issued in a 1904 State of the Union address by Teddy. And what it said was that basically, if there's a problem with a country, like say Latin America, there's a problem with a country, maybe they don't pay their debts or whatever, he said that only the United States could intervene in those countries, not foreign powers, because it's in like our sphere of influence, basically. And so that was something that he began to push with that. Like, of course, the big stick diplomacy was more or less this thing that he used to kind of as a threat, to prevent, foreign powers from coming in, but also, I guess, to keep the Latin American powers in check, also as, overall. If he did use force, if you know about this, they called it also gunboat diplomacy, which there were cases where he did send in, the Marines or whatever to some of these countries below, like Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, also as well. And so there were many cases where that actually did happen in the early 1900s when he was in power. Now, going back to and here's that quote, by the way. Suppose he said it at the Minnesota State Fair in September of 1901. Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. So that's the origin, they think, of it, more or less. Of course, it's been tested multiple times. The Monroe Doctrine, if you know about that, and several times it's been tested overall. I'll give you a bunch of examples of these, of course, that were. So these three main ones that were kind of before I guess he was really into power and all that. But the biggest one, if you know about it, was in Mexico when the French went in. It was around when the American Civil War was going on. Mexico, I think, had a bunch of debts they owed. And so the French went in there, took it over. They actually tried to form it into an empire under Emperor Maximilian. You may have heard of him, who was a nephew of Emperor Napoleon III. They were in power for 6 years, but the Mexicans were able to throw them out eventually. Then in Venezuela and British Guiana, they had a colony of the British in South America. They got in a border dispute in 1895, and that almost caused the War of Britain. You almost got in a war with them in 1895. Most people don't know that. But under Grover Cleveland, they were able to kind of avert going to war because they created some kind of arbitration to settle their border between both those states. Then there was one more in 1902 when after Roosevelt came in where Venezuela failed to pay their debts to Europe. So the Europeans were threatening to invade their country. And so Roosevelt intervened and forced the two sides to arbitrate, like the European powers in Venezuela, to avoid war. And there was something famous that was you may have heard about this, but there was a guy named Luis Drago, who was a foreign minister of Venezuela. He said that basically that nobody could intervene, like not the Americans, not Latin America, that the only way that they could, do this was through arbitration, I guess, between both sides. And so obviously a lot of the Latin American countries didn't like these ideas, like of Roosevelt or foreign powers or whatever coming in. And so Latin America, they would say, what, Yankee go home, that kind of thing. So they have a, negative opinion of us pretty much, big brother trying to, take control, things like that. They still kind of view that today kind of negatively against us throughout Latin America, still today, Now, of course, I'm going to get to, of course, we want to see that later blown up, but those are just kind of all kinds of things with the Roosevelt corollary where we've tried to intervene. You see Nicaragua, too, also in that list, also as well. But one of the main things that Roosevelt is very famous for, if you know about it, is for his construction of the Panama Canal. That's really his best thing he probably did foreign policy, which ended up being obviously a good idea in the end because it shortened the link between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, which before that you had to sail around South America, which was really difficult. So the Panama Canal was built between about a 10-year period, 1904 to 1914, you can see there. And like I said here, before the Panama Canal was built, there's different ways you could have done this. You either went all the way around from, like, say, the eastern coast of the United States to the Pacific coast by going around South America was one way you could do it. The other one that they would do, too, if you know about this, they would sail ships from the east coast to where the Isthmus of Panama is, and then cross it, like say a railroad, whatever it is, or walk it. And then you would basically get on a ship on the other side and then sail up the Pacific coast. And that's how you do it that way, basically. I think during the California gold rush, they started doing that to get people to like California that way because of the fact that there weren't railroads yet. They were built across the plains and all that, like we talked about later, that were built after the Civil War. I'll blow this up, but the French, by the way, if you know about this, tried to build the first canal, but it failed. There was a man named Ferdinand Lesseps who actually built the Suez Canal, which is, in Egypt, between, it links the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. He basically attempted to build a canal in the 1880s, which was, I think, was built in, I believe, in Nicaragua, I believe it was. Of course, the whole thing failed. They didn't have enough money. They went bankrupt. The climate was horrible. A lot of people died from disease like malaria, etc. And so the whole thing didn't work out, basically, in the end. And so that was in the 1800s when they tried that. And so it's going to be like another, I guess, 20 years or so, 20, 30 years later until they build actually, a real canal that actually connects, both oceans later. Now, if you know what happened, John Hay, who was the Secretary of State under Teddy Roosevelt, started then negotiating with the Colombians down there in South America, trying to buy part of the Isthmus of Panama, not the whole thing, but just a strip of land where they could actually build it. Anyway, the negotiations didn't go well. The Colombians kept stalling. They wanted more money. I think there was a case where Roosevelt got really angry about it. I don't know if you know the slang term Drago. Yeah, Dago. I think it is Dago. I believe it is. He said something like, "Those damn Dagos want too much money," or something like that was his famous quote about that. I think Dago is a slur term for a person who's either Latin or Italian, about that. But anyway, so what happened was a revolution. That's what happened. Basically, they had a revolution break out in 1903, which some people think the United States was kind of behind in plan. Anyway, just so happened that the USS Nashville, which was a gunboat, showed up when it broke out. The Panamanian Revolution, I think it's got different names that they called it. I think when that was. It was in November. Yeah, November the 4th is the date when the Panamanian Revolution broke out, which the U.S. immediately said Panama is a separate state, like a separate nation. And so they were declared independent. And so immediately after Panama broke away from Colombia, what happened after that was, of course, John Hay went back down there and began renegotiating again, this time with the Panamanians. This became known as the Hay-Bonao-Varea Treaty of 1903. I'll explain it, I'll kind of blow it up, which is right here, so you can see it. What was in the actual treaty? Well, this was what they were going to offer the Colombians originally, but of course they wanted more money, is what it was. The U.S. would be given a 99-year lease on a 10-mile strip of land where they would, build the canal. The U.S. would pay the Panamanians $10 million. And then, of course, they'd have also a yearly rental agreement that we'd pay every year to them, $250,000. So like a pretty good deal back then. Apparently, the Colombians wanted $20 million instead of $10 million. Americans thought that was too much. However, you know what happened? The U.S. later paid the Colombians 1921, $25 million. So I guess they could have saved $5 million if they would have done that other deal, I guess. So more or less, oh well, about that one. I do have a short video, of course, on the actual building of the Panama Canal, which I'll kind of show with you real quick.
Before 1900, if you wanted to sail from Florida to San Francisco, you would have to sail down the coast of South America and through the Straits of Magellan at Cape Horn. This was a long and often dangerous journey. As early as the 1500s, many countries showed an interest in finding a way to cross from one ocean to the other at the 50-mile-wide neck of land in Panama. Doing so would cut the 14,000-mile sea journey in half. But travel through Panama by foot or train was difficult because of the dense jungle, swamps, extreme weather, and danger of sickness. United States President Theodore Roosevelt came into office in 1901 and knew a canal was the practical answer and was determined to find a way to get it done. Engineers were hired to figure out how to build a canal through the difficult Panama landscape, and the United States put up the money. Construction of the canal began in 1904 and ended in 1914. It was a massive job and took many laborers to complete it. Over 5,000 American workers died from accident or disease during the project. The canal uses a system of locks. Because the water level between the oceans and the lakes in the canal are different, the ships must be raised and lowered. A ship enters a narrow passage, large gates are closed in front and behind the ship, and water is added or drained depending on which direction the ship is going. When the water level is the same as the ocean or lake, the gates are opened and the ship continues on through the canal. Now that the canal is over 100 years old and cargo ships are bigger than they were in 1914, expansions and upgrades have been done along the 50-mile canal. A recent expansion cost $5.2 billion. With around 40 ships per day passing through the Panama Canal, it is one busy place.
Right, a little short little video there. You can see, of course, the building of the Panama Canal, which there is, of course, a map of the Panama Canal that you're looking at. Of course, it's not all canal. You know, they got canals on both sides, on the east and western side of the isthmus. Then there's this big lake in the middle called Gatun Lake, where ships go through to travel to each side of the actual canal. Anyway, little statistics about the canal. The guy that actually designed it, built it, was an American, George Washington Girdles, who, by the way, was part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So he was the guy that was designed it and all that. So it's about a 50-mile waterway, you can see, that connects both the east, both the Atlantic Ocean, of course, and the Pacific Ocean. I don't know if they talked about the money, but yeah, $400 million. That's how much it costs to actually build the actual Panama Canal. So it's very expensive. I'm not sure what that would be today, but that would be obviously several $billion, now to construct it. Now, he mostly used workers that were from the Caribbean. About 90% of them probably came from there or more, mostly black workers that constructed it. Some Americans also were there as well, but only about 10% actually died. I think mostly Americans were the ones that actually died, I believe, mostly of disease, I guess, or other things from construction accidents or whatever. And I do have some pictures showing the famous parts of it. Of course, the most famous thing are the so-called locks, like you see right here. That's what it looks like with the water gone, drained from them. Here, of course, another picture showing some of the locks that are, of course, right here that you have. Let me kind of blow that up for you right here, but you can see kind of more bigger right there. So a lot of concrete and steel, went into the construction. They also had to move a lot of earth to form bodies of, river canals that would take them to the Gatun Lake that was between it. And the locks are important, by the way. It has like a total of 12 locks, which help to raise and lower the ships because of the fact that the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans have different sea levels. So you have to basically lower and raise ships to get to that correct level so they could move the ships across the isthmus. Each lock you see there is about 110 feet wide for like ships to get through. Of course, they have had some that have been widened, over time, more or less. I think I've got some other stats too on the canal. Here's some stuff right here, right there. It says over 14,000 ships handled annually. I guess that's a few years ago, maybe, when they put that up. Almost 40 million metric tons U.S. grain were transported through the Panama Canal in 2010. 42% of U.S. grain exports transit the Panama Canal. So just kind of statistics on that, which are very interesting right there. So canal was first opened in 1914 when the World War I broke out. They didn't let the Germans use it, by the way, which is kind of funny about that, more or less. But that's the total people that died with the French, though. I think mostly French people died trying to build, workers or whatever in, I guess, at Nicaragua or wherever it was. They built it, I believe, the first attempt right there. but mostly Americans. You can see Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, on that steam shovel sitting right here in the middle. All right, I want to go ahead and move on, of course, and talk about a few other things, of course. So Teddy Roosevelt would go out of power eventually. And, of course, you got this other guy that comes in, of course, you may have heard of, named Taft, William Howard Taft, who, of course, would be president only one term, 1909 to 1913. So he succeeded him. And one thing about Taft, which I'll get into in a second, Taft was basically a case where basically Teddy was able to actually pick him as his successor, which he would more or less. Teddy Roosevelt could have run for re-election. There was no real amendment that could have stopped him from running, for another term. So he could have served part of what is almost 3 terms, basically. But he decided not to run. And so what happened was Taft eventually won the 1908 presidential election. Like I said, Roosevelt was the first president to practically handpick his successor since Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, I think, had handpicked Martin Van Buren to basically replace him after he had served 2 terms as president in the early 1800s. And so Taft was put in. Taft was the Secretary of War, who was from Ohio and all that. But Taft really did not like politics. He was a jurist. He had served as a judge previously. He'd even been a professor. And it was a joke about Taft that Taft stood for take advice from Teddy, basically. You know about Taft, later he was famous for being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 1920s. This is under the Harding-Coolidge administrations. He's the only president, by the way, former president anyway, to basically be on the Supreme Court, which is true. So he really wanted to be a judge and lawyer, pretty much. And he had taught at Yale at one point. So he didn't really want to be politics. I think he said once that, "I hate politics," was his famous quote or something like that. Taft, by the way, defeated William Jennings Bryan, who ran, by the way, for a 3rd term. He tried to run for 3 times, his 3rd time running as president from Nebraska. He was a Democrat. And, of course, he easily won against Bryan. Bryan is kind of a loser. I think he tries to run in 1912, too, but he was put out the pasture overall. So Taft easily won, but they think Taft won mostly because of the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was popular. They thought he was just a replacement for him overall. Yeah, so here's another picture of Taft right here. There's, of course, Bryan versus Taft in the so-called 1908 election. You can see pretty much that Taft won in a landslide. He got like 2/3 of the electoral votes right here. Popular vote was a little closer, you can see, but electoral votes weren't even close, more or less. Taft has different nicknames, by the way. They sometimes call him the Big Lub. I don't know if you heard that story about Taft, but he weighed something like 340 pounds. It's like the heaviest man ever to be president of the United States. And there was a story where he was taking a bath, and you know what happened? He got stuck. And they couldn't get him out the bathtub, and so they had to get a bigger bathtub to take a bath. I think he was the first president also to play golf. Like golf becomes kind of a popular sport with a lot of the presidents, and he was the first one to play golf. So I can't imagine him playing golf, though. It's kind of fat. But anyway, but I guess he did. So anyway, I'll kind of get into Taft. Taft became, though, unpopular because he ends up being this kind of like a reactionary to some of Roosevelt's policies, like some progressive policies. And Taft tended to kind of maybe favor some of the industries, like the capitalist industries, over American citizens. And so some people thought he was basically this type of reactionary type politician that was kind of reversing some of Teddy Roosevelt's ideas. But some of that was like a myth about that. He actually was a pretty big trust buster. Like he busted more trusts than Teddy Roosevelt did, like double. I think I got 90. And then he may have broke up when he was president of the United States. In fact, the most famous case, of course, you heard about, we talked about before, was Standard Oil. It was broken up in 1911, that famous court case, Standard Oil of New Jersey versus the United States. And so, yeah, but obviously with, trust, it was something that he basically was known for, breaking up. So he definitely was kind of still progressive, but some people thought he was still kind of going the other way. He was known for the Mann-Elkins Act. I'll kind of mention that too in 1920, but they began the regulation of telecommunications. That means pretty much telephone lines, pretty much wireless telegraph industries. All that were basically regulated pretty much by the so-called Mann-Elkins Act on the authority, by the way, of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is there. Also controversial, 1909, Congress passed the so-called 16th Amendment, which would be later the so-called federal income tax, but it took years for them to actually ratify it, the states. A lot of people didn't want to do it, and I think it took to like 1913. It wasn't ratified until Woodrow Wilson came in. So that's kind of a controversial amendment that people still hate, today, I think. Now, there's that one thing that he is known for that obviously, was the most controversial thing. There's the Mann-Elkins Act, if you want to look at that, of course, later, which is there. I could blow it up for you right here. The Mann-Elkins Act, so that regulated that with the ICC, of course. Now, there was a one, of course, that really kind of made people mad, which was the Payne-Aldrich Tariff or Payne-Aldrich Act, which came out in 1909. I think I've got the year wrong of the Mann-Elkins Act. That's not correct. It should be 1910, excuse me. But that one angered the American public because it raised tariffs on a lot of goods. I know among the Republican progressives kind of made them pretty mad. And it ended up splitting up the Republican Party, which it would. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt would break from Taft. And he realized that he and Taft weren't on the same page, on some of his policies and all that. And so a lot of people that were progressives that were in the Republican and also the Democrat Party felt betrayed by what Taft did, backing this act, which increased a lot of tariffs on imported goods. I know it hurt a lot of the farmers and other people that kind of depended on that. And so that was one thing that really caused later Teddy Roosevelt to want to run for re-election again, which he would, of course, in 1912. Then there's one more thing I will mention about Taft that is well known. Taft was famous for the so-called dollar diplomacy you may have heard of, that, of course, the U.S. started doing, which I guess is still around today. We still kind of do this. And dollar diplomacy was this new kind of policy where Taft, instead of using like the force of the big stick, force of U.S. military, he substituted dollars for bullets to try to gain friends and allies in Latin America. And so it was a way to kind of replace, gunboat diplomacy, but still keep our sphere of influence and control over Latin American foreign policy and all that. And so it also, you can see there, it encouraged a lot of bankers to lend money to Central America. You can see the U.S. also encouraged investment into Latin American mines, banana plantations, coffee plantations, also building railroads throughout Latin America. So it was kind of a way to make friends, in Latin America, but they still hated us. You think about it. But that's something we still do later. That pretty much, that's done, in the future, 20th century and later, probably still done today pretty much. And so that's something that he started doing, that other presidents started doing, later overall. So so-called dollar diplomacy, of course, started by Taft. All right, so let me, of course, move on. Of course, what we're going to get to next, I'm going to talk about the 1912 election, which is really kind of considered one of the most famous elections in the early 1900s in American history. There's actually 4 people that run for president. Yeah, they had 4 that ran, believe it or not. 1912 election, of course, included, the Republican Party had this rift I told you about where Taft and Roosevelt kind of split. So they actually would end up running against each other, separate now like 2 parties where Taft had the Republican Party and Roosevelt had his own party. He had later called the Progressive Party. It was called, Roosevelt campaigned on this new platform that he came up with, which he called, by the way, New Nationalism. I think he started campaigning on this back in 1910. Some of these ideas he started trying to push that he wanted to, be part of American politics, society, and all that. And so some of these on the agenda he talked about was the idea of women's right to vote, women's suffrage. So he thought that women ought to have the right to vote. Some states were already voting where they had women participating. Stricter child labor laws he wanted. I think you can still be I think over 10, you can still work or whatever. But he wanted basically stricter labor laws for children. He wanted to back the labor unions. So he thought the federal government ought to support labor unions because they're in support of average Americans that are hardworking in general. National retirement system, like Social Security, I guess he's talking about, which his cousin FDR developed later, that. So that's something he first came up with. 8-hour workday, which I think the federal government already had at that time, but he wanted everybody to have an 8-hour workday. Not really anymore, I guess, but people work more than 8 now, but yeah. Also, other things, he wanted to lower tariffs. Of course, the Payne-Aldrich Act, of course, we talked about that he was mad about. He wanted that to be also lowered. Supported the idea of initiative recall referendum I talked about before. That was something he wanted nationwide that was being used in other states like Wisconsin. And so those are kind of some ideas that he wanted to go against Taft and the Republican Party, Roosevelt. There's some stuff right here. Of course, some other stuff you can see. Talks about minimum wage for women. You see right here, national health care. He also came up with that idea, too, that there ought to be a national health care system for everybody also as well. So ease in amending the Constitution. Took 3/4 of the states to amend the Constitution. He thought that was something that they ought to make it easier. I guess because they couldn't pass they were having trouble with the 13th Amendment. Excuse me, no, 16th Amendment, the income tax that we talked about, the 16th Amendment. So maybe that's what he's talking about with that, wanting to do that. But what happened was, even though he was, wanted to be president again, the Republican Party kind of turned him out. And then what happened was in Chicago, at the Republican National Convention, they picked Taft over Teddy Roosevelt. He got angry, and so he and his supporters all left. They left the convention. And in Chicago, same city, they basically formed a third party, which was called the Progressive Party. It was called, which they later dubbed it the so-called Bull Moose Party. How did the name Bull Moose Party come from? Well, apparently there was a man that shot him, if you know the story about this, named John Schrank. I've got a short video I can show you on this, but there was a man, he was giving a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and a man came up to him and shot him in the chest. Here's a short video on this incident that almost killed him.
On October 14, 1912, former President Theodore Roosevelt was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to deliver a speech because he was campaigning for another run as president. Before he delivered his speech, he was shot in the chest by John Fleming Schrank. The bullet entered his chest but was slowed down by a steel eyeglass case and his thick 50-page speech. The bullet lodged itself in his chest muscle. Roosevelt had said that since he wasn't bleeding from the mouth, he knew the bullet hadn't hit his lungs, so he planned to continue giving his speech. While blood seeped through his shirt, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." It was later determined by doctors that Roosevelt was safer leaving the bullet in his chest muscle than removing it, so he lived the rest of his life with a bullet in his chest. John Fleming Schrank later wrote that he was told by the ghost of President William McKinley in a dream to avenge his death and that he needed to assassinate Roosevelt. Schrank was admitted to the Central State Mental Hospital in Wisconsin, and he lived there until he died of natural causes.
A little short video there, of course, on Schrank. Yeah, he was kind of insane. Of course, I guess he thought that maybe Roosevelt was behind William McKinley's assassination. I don't know, maybe not, probably not. But anyway, so that's who that was. And of course, yeah, he made that famous statement about you can see right there, but I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. Or I think he also said later, I feel as strong as a bull moose. I think it's something he would say. And so hence the name being used for the actual political party, that third party that he formed, the so-called Progressive Party. So, yeah, it happened on October 14th, 1912 in Milwaukee. That's where he got shot, of course, like they said. But anyway, so, yeah, he would, of course, run against other men. There was they had Taft, like I said, and him running more or less. But they also had these other men that ran too. Of course, Woodrow Wilson, of course, one of the men that runs. Before I talk about Wilson, though, they had this other man, a third man that ran before Wilson, of course, too, as well, that was running along with him. Like I say, so we got a fourth guy, Eugene V. Debs. He ran in 1912. He, I think, ran 4 times at one point, Debs, who was the socialist, and he polled almost 1 million votes in the election, which is pretty good for a socialist candidate. But Wilson, you see there, who was from New Jersey, he would end up being more successful than the other 3 men, of course, that ran in 1912. Wilson was a governor of New Jersey. He was also the former president of Princeton University, which, by the way, is kind of controversial about that. So I'll kind of talk about later about why he's controversial, Wilson. But he kind of was this famous reformer. He was, pro-progressive, kind of like, Teddy Roosevelt was. He had his own platform he ran on that was called New Freedom. So the New Freedom platform. He had all kinds of things that he wanted to do also as well. Woodrow Wilson, he wanted to reduce tariffs, just like what Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do. He favored a graduate income tax, of course, which they still hadn't, ratified the 16th Amendment yet at this point. Favored the U.S. Senators' popular vote as well, which would eventually pretty much be created after that. It was an amendment. He wanted a national banking system. That was one idea that was kind of controversial, by the way, because some people don't like the Federal Reserve. You know that today. Some people are kind of opposed to it and want to get rid of it, all of that. He also favored stronger antitrust laws, which would later lead to the so-called Clayton Antitrust Act that would be developed. He also wanted some kind of trade commission to regulate trade in the country, Federal Trade Commission, which would be created. A lot of these ideas were ideas that Wilson actually did. That's well known. Anyway, Wilson would end up winning in a landslide. He wanted a landslide election. Well, popular vote, I think, was more closer, I think, if you study about it. But with the electoral vote, it wasn't even close with the other candidates, with Wilson winning. It was a win for progressives and people that are more liberal over the conservatives. Wilson got 435 electoral votes. Whoa, that's a lot. Roosevelt got only 88. Taft only got 8 electoral votes. That's awful, basically. So That's got to be one of the worst elections that an incumbent lost in overall. But like I said, Taft would later end up being Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but that would be in the 1920s when he'll kind of come back and do something important in the federal government, more or less. Wilson, by the way, was a pretty successful president. I wouldn't say he was one of the best presidents we had, but he's considered, probably in the top 20 maybe overall. He is kind of controversial, not just because of some of his policies that some people didn't like, like prohibition. That was one thing that people didn't like. People didn't like the Federal Reserve. People didn't like the federal income tax, that eventually was, I think, pretty much ratified under him as well. He is controversial because some people view Wilson as being kind of racist. And I know at Princeton, when he was the president of Princeton, he refused to allow African Americans to go to school there, and so that's why they tore his statue down and took his name off buildings and stuff like that. Also, Wilson was known for I think when he was in the White House, he showed that movie. You ever seen The Birth of the Nation? Which is a kind of a controversial movie made in the early 1900s, which is about the Ku Klux Klan. He showed it in the White House, and so that's you can understand why people kind of view him as being kind of controversial. Wilson served 2 terms. I'll get to, of course, the first part today. Of course, his first term is dominated by progressive reforms, which I'll get into, cover a few things about that today. And then his second term is dominated by World War I, which breaks out in Europe, and also with conflicts in Mexico. The so-called Mexican Revolution breaks out, which is a real problem on our border. We're even attacked by Pancho Villa in New Mexico. And so he even sends troops into Mexico at one point to kind of deal with the problems with Mexico. But that's later, when I'll get to that, probably later in the week, more or less. Let me talk about some of the reforms of Woodrow Wilson. You can see he was born in Virginia in 1856. He was also an historian, which is true, about Woodrow Wilson, which is right there. These are some things that, of course, he is famous for, pretty much that was developed under his administration. They have the Underwood Tariff, which you can see there. The Underwood Tariff reduced tariffs, which, remember I told you the Payne-Aldrich Tariff had increased the tariffs, like we talked about before. And it reduced tariffs by a large amount on thousands of imported goods. In fact, you can see it reduced the duties on average from 41% to 29%. You can see there. Also, there was something that was kind of famous about the Underwood Tariff that you may have heard about. They put a provision in there about an income tax, graduated income tax, basically, which I think was considered unconstitutional. But eventually the 16th Amendment, of course, was eventually ratified in 1913. So it came out in 1913. Eventually, finally, the states, 3/4 of them at least, ratified it, and that it became law after that. This, by the way, was the original taxes that people paid. Like, you made certain amounts of money with your occupation or whatever it is. 3,000 and less paid no tax. You didn't pay any taxes. You made that little of money. You made 3,000 to about 20,000. You paid a 1% tax. The highest bracket was $500,000 and above, which was 6%. The 6% tax, which is like about $30,000. That's a pretty good deal. I think 6%. I say I get 6%. Now the highest bracket pays 37%, but I think up to like the 1950s, I think the taxes were like really high, like really high, like almost all the money. Just about, if you were like an upper bracket, they took all your money just about later on. But that's pretty good, with that early on. But like I said, people still didn't like the idea of the federal income tax, and people still don't like it today. Like my wife and I owe money this year, like $2,600, the federal government. Shh. So anyway, but we get the money back, though. I guess everybody's getting that money, that stimulus money, basically this year. The stimulus money, huh? Wow. But anyway, so let me talk about the thing that Wilson's famous for. Of course, that the Federal Reserve System. That's kind of considered one of his babies that he created. That's of course well known. This was the idea of a national banking system to, create something that wasn't really there before. They had a national banking system going back to Jackson's time, but some of those had been broken up, basically. And what it was a system founded in 1913 where they broke up the country into 12 districts with district banks. And each one would be controlled by a Federal Reserve Board, which is based in Washington, D.C. And of course, the whole system, if you know about it, is often called the Fed for short. And part of why they developed this whole thing was to regulate monetary policies, throughout the country. Also to, circulate, the correct amount of money in the market. I guess keep interest rates a certain amount, in the country. And so it also helps to regulate the financial markets, you can see also as well. So it's something that he's, of course, famous for in helping to develop through Congress, more or less. And which he was in favor of when he ran, for president in 1912. Also, this other thing you may have heard of was the so-called Federal Trade Commission. He also was famous for that. The Federal Trade Commission is something he's known for as well. And that was created by Congress in 1914, which basically allowed the ICC, the Interstate Commerce and Interstate Commerce Commission, to basically control, trade and all that. So those two would work together basically to control trade in the country, the FTC. FTC was created, you can see there, to prevent a lot of the monopolies from growing, prevent them from taking off. But also create, you can see there, better understanding between where the two could work together, federal government and business, to create better practices and things like that, and follow regulations and rules. So FTC was something that, kind of came out, that was something he was also known for as well. Also, you can see too that they had the Clayton Antitrust Act, was another thing that he was known for, Wilson, as well. And I'll put up on the screen here, but it strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been developed back in 1890. Henry Sherman had created it a long time ago. Anyway, this particular act made monopolies illegal. It also declared labor unions legal. You can see there, something that, Teddy Roosevelt had wanted when he ran in 1912. And so this is the first instance where the federal government began to actually recognize organized labor in America. And they also recognized the idea that they could go on strike, they could have pickets, boycotts, things like that, which were methods that a lot of unions used, and so on. And so that was something that that was done starting with this act, with Wilson, under Wilson, more or less. So those are some things that under his administration that he was kind of known for overall. There was also a bunch of amendments I did want to mention again before. I think I've kind of talked about them already. But under Wilson, you had the 17th Amendment, 18th Amendment, also in the 19th Amendment, of course, which all pretty much came out ratified under his administration. The senator popular vote, you can see 17th Amendment. Of course, the controversial one there, you see national prohibition, 18th Amendment. Of course, 1919, I think, is when it came out, ratified in 1920. And that one was really unpopular, but they mostly did it because of World War I and the shortage of grain, and also the temperance movement, which I talked about before. And later they had the women's right to vote. And of course, that would allow women to vote, I think in 1920. I think when Harding ran basically and won that election in 1920. A few other things that might be it, of course, about this period. But of course, Wilson would run for re-election, by the way. And Wilson would serve, like I said, 2 terms as president of the United States. He did run for a second term, by the way, against Charles Evan Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice who was from New York, governor of New York at one point. And he won the election, but it was actually pretty close. The close election. The reason why was because of the fact that part of it was because of World War I. And a lot of people were kind of concerned that Wilson wouldn't be able to deal with the issues of World War I raging in Europe at the time. And then the other issue was Mexico. Mexico had attacked the United States, I believe, I think in his first term and all that. And so basically they weren't happy about that either. And you had a lot of people that wanted to keep the United States out of the war. And so Wilson campaigned on this slogan that he came up with, which was, "He kept us out of war," which helped him pretty much, I think, win the election more or less. But if you know what happened later, he reneged on it and he got the U.S. involved in World War I, fighting Germany. But it was part of this America First policy that you may have heard about that's been in American history before, where they wanted to be in isolationism and not get involved in Europe's problems and all of that. But they were eventually kind of sucked into it because of German aggression in the Atlantic and other places in the world. And so later we ended up, of course, in that war, which I'll talk about pretty much later in the week. Yeah, Wilson, there we go. He defeated Charles Evan Hughes in a close election. You can see electoral votes were pretty close, 277 to 254 there, but I think the popular vote wasn't as close, of course, in that election. So anyway, that's pretty much it lecture-wise for the early 1900s under Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and of course Wilson. Of course, later in the week on what is Thursday, I'm going to get, of course, into mostly the World War I era, talk about how the United States kind of gets involved with World War I. But I will kind of first talk about the so-called Mexican Revolution that happens near our border with Mexico. That's a conflict that also we kind of get involved in. That's kind of a problem under Wilson's administration. So I'll get into that first before I really get into World War I. But don't forget, as a reminder, that y'all do have that first exam that I did post, of course, in quizzes. That's going to be due sometime at the end of next week. So make sure you start working on that. Make sure you go back, of course, and look at the previous lectures, like the 4 lectures, of course, that the exam is on. It's really like a big mini quiz, really is what it is. But pretty much you get 2 attempts on it for that particular exam. And if you have any questions about the exam or about any of my lectures previously, please let me know. Like I've said before, you can leave me comments, questions, about pretty much the lecture anytime you want, more or less. And that's it for today. I will see you, of course, Thursday. Hope y'all have, of course, a good rest of the week out there. And y'all take care. So y'all see you later. Bye.